The sun was a hammer, and the parched earth was the anvil. Alara felt every blow, a rhythmic pounding in her skull that matched the desperate thud of her own heart. Each step was a negotiation with dust and gravity, a fight her worn-out boots were losing. The leather was cracked, the soles thin enough to feel the bite of every sharp stone. Beside her, a smaller, quicker rhythm kept pace, the frantic, determined steps of her son, Thomas. He was 7 years old, but his eyes held the weary caution of a man who had seen too many horizons promise nothing. His small hand was a permanent fixture in hers, a warm, sweaty anchor in a world that had come loose from its moorings. His face, smudged with dirt and streaked with the salt of dried sweat, was tilted upward, his gaze fixed on the shimmering distance. "Is it much farther, Mama?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. Alara tried to swallow, but her throat was a desert. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had enough water to waste on a proper swallow. "Not much," she lied. The lie was a flimsy thing, as thin as the shade from the lone, skeletal mesquite tree they'd passed a mile back. They were following a wagon trail that had grown faint, 2 shallow ruts that could have been made last week or last year. It promised civilization, a town, a well, something other than this endless, bleached expanse of brown and pale blue. But the promise was fading with the daylight. She stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose rock hidden in the dust. A sharp cry escaped her lips, bitten off before it could become a sob. Thomas's grip tightened instantly. He was her little man, her fierce protector, and the sight of his worried frown was a greater pain than the fire shooting up her leg. "Mama, I'm all right, Tom," she gasped, forcing herself upright. But she wasn't. The world tilted, the horizon blurring into a wash of heat shimmer. The strength that had carried them from the ruin of their life in East Texas, across plains and through gullies, was finally gone. It had frayed and unraveled mile by grueling mile, and now the last thread had snapped. Her knees buckled, and she sank into the dust, the rough ground a surprisingly soft welcome. "Mama, get up." Thomas's voice was sharp with a fear that cut through her daze. He tugged at her arm, his small body straining with the effort. "We can't stop here. The sun's going down." He was right. Night in this country wasn't a peaceful blanket. It was a shroud that hid things with teeth and claws, 2-legged and 4. But her body was a mutinous vessel. It refused to obey. Her legs were lead, her head a buzzing hive. "Just a minute, baby," she whispered, her cheek pressed against the hot, gritty earth. "Mama just needs a minute." A minute stretched into 5, the sun bleeding orange and purple at the edge of the world. The air began to cool, but it brought no relief, only the promise of a different kind of harshness. It was Tom who saw it first. He had stood over her, a small, defiant sentinel, his eyes scanning their desolate surroundings. "Mama," he said, his voice different. Not scared, but focused. "Look." Alara forced her head up. Her vision swam, but she followed his pointing finger. Far off the trail, nestled against a low rise of hills that were turning a deep, bruised purple in the twilight, was a shape. It was too solid, too square to be a trick of the light. A structure, a barn. And where there was a barn, there was a house. Where there was a house, there was water. And people. Hope was a dangerous, painful thing. It felt like swallowing glass. But for Tom, she would swallow it. She tried to push herself up again, but a wave of dizziness sent her reeling. "I can't, Tom," she breathed, the admission tasting like ash. "I can't walk another step." He looked from her to the distant silhouette of the barn, his small jaw set in a line of grim determination she knew all too well. It was his father's jawline, but the strength behind it was all his own. He looked back at her, his child's eyes filled with a terrifyingly adult resolve. "You wait here," he said, his voice steady. "Don't move." Before she could protest, he let go of her hand and started walking, not running, toward the barn. He moved with a purpose that belied his size, a small figure dwindling against a vast, indifferent landscape. Alara watched him go, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. What was he doing? What could a 7-year-old boy possibly do? She called his name, but her voice was a feeble croak, lost in the rising whisper of the evening wind. She was helpless, stranded, watching the only thing she had left in the world walk away into the growing darkness. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The barn was bigger up close, its weathered gray planks seeming to scrape the bruised twilight sky. It smelled of hay, dust, and the warm, earthy scent of livestock. It smelled of life. To Thomas, it smelled of safety. He crept to the edge of the massive, slightly ajar door, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Peeking inside, he saw the cavernous, shadowy interior, stalls lining one wall, a huge hayloft overhead. A lone lantern cast a pool of flickering gold light near the center of the floor, and in that light, a man was working. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with a stillness about him that was as much a part of the landscape as the silent hills. He was mending a piece of harness, his large, calloused hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace. He hadn't heard the boy approach. Thomas knew what Mama would say. Don't bother strangers. Don't ask for charity. We make our own way. But Mama was lying in the dust a quarter-mile away, unable to move. Her rules were for a world that still had rules. This was a different world. He took a deep breath, the hay-scented air filling his small lungs, and stepped out of the shadows into the lantern light. "Mister," the man's head snapped up. His hands froze on the leather strap. His face was weathered, carved with lines of sun and sorrow, and his eyes, a startlingly pale gray, narrowed with suspicion. He wasn't a man accustomed to visitors, especially not ones who appeared out of the dusk like small ghosts. "What do you want, boy?" His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't welcoming either. Thomas's throat went dry, but he thought of his mother, her face pale in the dirt, and the words came tumbling out, a rehearsed plea he'd constructed on his long walk from the trail. "Please, mister. My mama's sick. She fell back on the trail. She's real tired. Can't tread another mile." He paused, gathering his courage, and pushed forward with the most important part. The part that wasn't charity. "I saw your barn. It's a good barn. But it gets dusty. I can sweep it. I'll sweep the whole thing, every last bit of it, for a place for us to sleep. Just for the night. Out of the wind." He held his breath, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was offering the only thing he had, his labor. It was a meager offering against the vastness of the man's barn and the depth of their need, but it was an honest one. The man, Silas Croft, stared at the boy. He saw the threadbare shirt, the patched trousers, the fierce, desperate hope in his young eyes. He'd lived alone on this ranch for 5 years, since Martha had been taken by the fever. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his fences, his conversations limited to the occasional grunts exchanged with the clerk at the general store in Prairie Dog Creek, 10 miles away. He had forgotten the sound of another human voice on his land that wasn't his own. Now this, a dirt-streaked child offering to sweep his barn, a barn that was already as clean as a barn had any right to be, in exchange for shelter. He should have said no. Vagrants brought trouble. They had nothing and they wanted everything. That's what folks in town said. Turn one away, or you'll have a dozen at your door. But then he looked past the boy's bravado and saw the tremor in his chin. He saw the shadow of a woman collapsing on a lonely trail. He remembered Martha, how she'd once given their last spare blanket to a family whose wagon had broken down in a winter storm. "There's no currency in cruelty, Silas," she used to say. "Kindness is the only thing you can give away and still have more of." Silas laid the harness aside, the leather creaking in the sudden silence. He rose to his full height, a formidable figure in the flickering light. For a terrifying second, Thomas thought the man was going to grab a pitchfork and chase him off. Instead, the man's gruff expression softened by a fraction of an inch. He let out a long, slow breath. "Never mind the sweeping," the words rumbled from his chest. "Where's your mother?" Silas Croft's ranch was a testament to one man's war against entropy. The fences were taut, the posts solid. The cabin, a simple structure of hand-hewn logs, was small but sturdy, with a stone chimney that rose straight and true. Smoke curled from it now, a thin gray ribbon against the indigo sky. Alara watched it from the porch swing where Silas had deposited her after carrying her from the trail, as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour. The act of being carried had been mortifying. It was a surrender, an admission of utter defeat that chafed at her pride. Yet the strength in his arms, the steady, unhurried way he'd walked, had felt less like pity and more like a simple, physical fact. You have fallen. I will lift you. She was too exhausted to parse it further. Now, a blanket was wrapped around her shoulders, and a tin mug of warm, sweet coffee was cradled in her hands. Inside the cabin, she could hear the low murmur of Silas's voice and Tom's higher, more excited replies. They were at the kitchen table. Silas had produced a half-full jar of preserved peaches, and Tom was recounting their journey with the unfiltered, dramatic flair of a 7-year-old. Alara cringed, hoping he wasn't revealing too much. They had to be careful. The world was full of people who would use their story against them. Her story was a common one, in its own tragic way. She had married a charming man who had turned cruel behind closed doors. When Jonah died in a saloon brawl, his family, who had always viewed her as a penniless outsider, saw their chance. They tried to have her declared an unfit mother, to take Tom to be raised by his uncle, a man with Jonah's temper and none of his charm. So she had fled, taking only what they could carry and the few dollars she had hidden in a loose floorboard. They were heading west, toward the vague promise of California, where no one knew their names. But the West was bigger and emptier than she had ever imagined, and their money had run out 100 miles ago. The cabin door creaked open, and Silas stepped out onto the porch. He didn't look at her at first, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last sliver of sun had vanished, leaving a sky littered with stars. "He's a good boy," Silas said, his voice quiet. "Brave." Alara clutched the warm mug. "He had to be." Silas nodded, accepting this. He sat down not on the swing with her, but on the top step of the porch, giving her space. He leaned his forearms on his knees, his big hands dangling between them. They sat in silence for a long moment. The only sounds the chirping of crickets and the soft sigh of the wind through the tall prairie grass. It was a comfortable silence, not an awkward one. Silas seemed to be a man who was on intimate terms with silence. "He ate half a jar of my peaches," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'm sorry. I'll pay you back for them. For the coffee, too. As soon as I can find work." Her voice was stiff with ingrained pride. Silas finally turned his head to look at her. In the dim light from the cabin window, his face was all shadows and angles. "No need." Martha put up more peaches than one man could eat in a decade. The name hung in the air between them. Martha, a wife. Of course, a good, sturdy woman who would have kept this place humming with life, who would have put up those peaches. Alara felt a pang of something, not jealousy, but a deep, resonant sadness. This man's solitude was not a choice, it was a wound. "The boy can sleep on the pallet by the fire," Silas continued, his voice back to its gruff, practical tone. "You can take the bed. I'll be in the barn. There's an old cot out there." "No," Alara said, too quickly. "We can't put you out of your own house. The barn is fine. It's what my son asked for." "The boy asked for shelter, not a specific location," Silas countered, his logic unassailable. "The cot's comfortable enough. I've slept on it before." He stood up, a signal that the debate was over. "There's stew on the stove. Eat. You both need it." He disappeared into the darkness, toward the barn without another word. Alara listened to the sound of his footsteps fading, the crunch of his boots on the dry ground. She looked into the cabin, at her son curled up on a braided rug before the hearth, his face relaxed in sleep for the first time in weeks, his belly full of stew and peaches. She had stumbled into the quiet center of a man's grief, a place he had clearly walled off from the rest of the world. And he had, for reasons she couldn't begin to fathom, opened the gate just wide enough for her and her son to slip through. For the first time in a long, long time, Alara allowed herself to feel a sliver of something other than fear. It felt fragile and foreign, but she recognized it all the same. It was gratitude. The next morning, Alara was awake before the sun. She slipped out of the narrow bed, the mattress filled with corn husks that rustled with every movement. The cabin was warm, the fire in the hearth banked to embers. Tom was still asleep, a peaceful lump under a heavy quilt. She found a bucket and the pump outside. The cold water on her face was a shock, washing away the last vestiges of sleep and the grime of the trail. As the sky lightened from charcoal to a soft, dove gray, she took stock of her new, temporary world. The ranch was small but meticulously cared for. There was a vegetable garden near the house, struggling against the dry soil but clearly tended with a patient hand. A few chickens scratched in a wired-off run. A lone, sturdy-looking horse watched her from a corral. It was a place of order and hard work. She wouldn't be a burden. Her pride, the last currency she possessed, wouldn't allow it. By the time Silas emerged from the barn, blinking in the new light, she had coaxed the fire back to life, found the coffee pot, and located a skillet. She was standing over the stove, frying slices of salt pork she'd found in the cooler box when he walked in. He stopped in the doorway, the scent of coffee and frying meat filling the small cabin. He looked at her, then at the stove, a flicker of surprise in his gray eyes. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You gave us shelter," she replied, not looking up from her task. "We will earn our keep." It became their unspoken agreement. There was no discussion of terms, no formal arrangement. Alara simply began to work. After a breakfast eaten in near silence, broken only by Tom's chatter, she found a broom and swept the cabin and the porch until they were spotless. She discovered the struggling vegetable garden and spent the afternoon on her knees, pulling weeds with a vengeance, her hands finding a familiar comfort in the soil. She found Martha's sewing basket, the thread and the needles untouched for years, and set about mending the worn patches on Tom's trousers and her own thin dress. Silas watched her from a distance. He went about his own chores, mending the fence at the far end of the pasture, checking the water level in the stock tank, currying his horse, but he was always aware of her. He saw the efficient way she moved, the determined set of her jaw. She worked with a silent, ferocious energy, as if trying to scrub away the memory of her own desperation. She wasn't asking for a handout. She was claiming a place through sheer force of will. Tom, meanwhile, became Silas's shadow. He followed the man from the corral to the workshop, a constant stream of questions pouring from him. "What's the horse's name? Why is the fence made of wire? Can I help? What's that tool for?" At first, Silas answered in monosyllables. The horse's name was Boulder. The wire kept the coyotes out. No, a wrench. But Tom's relentless curiosity began to wear down his defenses. By the end of the day, Silas found himself explaining the mechanics of the water pump, showing the boy how to hold a hammer properly. He even carved a small, rough horse out of a scrap of pine for him. When he handed it to Tom, the boy's eyes lit up with a joy so pure it almost hurt to look at. In the evening, they ate again. Alara had made a thick soup from potatoes and onions from the garden, supplemented with a bit of dried beef she'd found in the pantry. It was simple food, but it was hot and filling. "The garden looks good," Silas commented, his eyes on his bowl. It was the highest praise he could muster. "The soil is dry," Alara said, "but it's good soil. It just needs water. And attention. Like us," she thought. After dinner, while she washed the dishes, Silas sat at the table, showing Tom a card trick. Alara watched their reflections in the dark window pane. The big, somber man and the small, eager boy, their heads bent together in the warm lamplight. A fragile picture of domesticity, an illusion that felt dangerously real. They spent a week this way. A routine settled over them, as natural as the rising and setting of the sun. Alara cooked and cleaned and tended the garden. Silas worked his ranch. Tom bridged the gap between them. The unspoken question of their departure hung in the air, but neither of them addressed it. To speak of it would be to break the spell. The first crack in their sanctuary came on a trip to town. One of their hens had gone broody, and Silas announced he was going to Prairie Dog Creek to get some supplies and see if he could trade for a new laying hen. "Tom and I will come with you," Alara stated. It wasn't a request. "We need things." She didn't say that her dress was one good snag away from falling apart, or that Tom's shoes were more whole than leather. Silas hesitated. He was used to being invisible in town, a quiet man who bought his flour and salt and left. Arriving with a woman and a child would be like setting off a firecracker in a library. But he looked at Alara's determined face and simply nodded. Prairie Dog Creek was not so much a town as a collection of dusty buildings huddled together for comfort against the vast emptiness of the plains. There was a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church whose steeple seemed to be accusing the sky. As Silas pulled his wagon to a stop in front of the store, Alara felt the eyes on them. They came from the women sweeping their porches, from the men lounging in the shade of the store's awning, from the severe-looking woman peering out the window of the parsonage next to the church. The gazes were sharp and probing, full of a hungry, starved curiosity. Inside the store, the whispers started. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a man with a perpetually worried expression, greeted Silas with his usual nod. But his eyes kept darting to Alara and Tom. "Silas," he said, lowering his voice. "Got yourself some company." "This is Mrs. Alara," Silas said, his voice flat and non-negotiable. "And her boy, Tom. They're staying with me." The simple statement was a bombshell. Alara could feel the temperature in the room drop. A woman in a calico dress near the fabric bolts stopped pretending to look at patterns and stared openly. "Staying with him." The words dripped with insinuation. Alara kept her head held high, her spine straight. She would not let them see her shame or her fear. She moved through the store, picking out only the barest necessities, a small bag of flour, some thread, a bar of soap. She was acutely aware of the cost of each item, a running tally of her debt to Silas growing in her mind. The worst moment came when she was looking at the children's shoes. They were sturdy, ugly things, but they would protect Tom's feet. She picked up a pair, her heart sinking as she saw the price chalked on the sole. It was an impossible sum. "Find a pair that fits him." Silas's voice came from behind her. She turned, startled. "I can't. They're too much." "I didn't ask what they cost," he said gruffly. "I said find a pair that fits." Before she could argue, the pastor's wife, Mrs. Gable, materialized beside them. She was a tall, thin woman with a face that looked like it had been soured by vinegar. Her eyes, small and black like a crow's, raked over Alara's worn dress. "Silas Croft," she said, her voice dripping with sanctimonious concern. "I was surprised to see you with companions. The ladies of the church auxiliary have been worried about you, all alone out there." "I'm not alone now," Silas said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. But Mrs. Gable was not so easily deterred. "Of course, it is a Christian duty to offer charity to vagrants. But one must be careful. A man in your position, a widower. It isn't proper, having a woman living in your home without the sanction of marriage. People will talk." The word vagrant struck Alara like a slap. Her face burned. She felt every eye in the store on her, branding her. She was a charity case. A scandal. Silas stepped slightly in front of her, a subtle, protective movement. His gaze on Mrs. Gable was as cold and hard as granite. "What people talk about in their sewing circles is their business, Mildred. What happens on my ranch is mine." He picked up the shoes Alara was holding, grabbed Tom's hand, and strode to the counter. "Put these on my account, Henderson." The ride back to the ranch was silent. Tom was thrilled with his new shoes, admiring them from every angle, oblivious to the tension that crackled in the wagon. Alara stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap, the shame from the store a bitter taste in her mouth. She had brought this on him. Her presence, her very existence, was a stain on his reputation. When they arrived back at the cabin, she waited until Tom was out of earshot, chasing a chicken, before she spoke. "We'll leave in the morning," she said, her voice hollow. Silas stopped unhitching Boulder from the wagon. He turned to face her slowly. "Why? You heard her. You heard them all. I won't be the cause of your ruin. We are grateful for your kindness, Mr. Croft, more than I can ever say. But we can't stay." "Her name is Mildred Gable," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She uses God as a cudgel to beat people who don't live by her narrow rules. You're going to let a woman like that run you off. It's not just her. It's the whole town. They look at me and they see something shameful." "What do you see when you look at me?" he asked, the question so unexpected it took her breath away. She looked at him then, truly looked at him. She saw the tired lines around his eyes, the solitude that clung to him like a second skin. She saw the calloused hands that could be surprisingly gentle. She saw the man who had carried her from the dust, who had fed her son, who had stood between her and the scorn of an entire town. "I see a good man," she whispered, the words tasting of truth. "Then that's all that matters," he said. "This is my land, my home. No one tells me who is welcome here. No 1 inch." He turned back to his horse, his back a rigid line of defiance. The discussion was over. But Alara knew it wasn't. The encounter in town hadn't been an ending. It had been a warning shot. The outside world, with its sharp edges and sharper tongues, was not going to leave them alone. Their quiet sanctuary was more fragile than she had ever realized. The days that followed the trip to town were different. A new awareness existed between them, a shared understanding of the lines Silas had drawn in the dust. He had defended her. He had claimed them, in a way. The quiet comfort of their routine was now underscored by a subtle tension, a feeling of borrowed time. Alara worked harder than ever, as if her labor could build a wall high enough to keep the judgment of Prairie Dog Creek at bay. She revitalized the garden with a ferocity that amazed Silas. Using a system of small, hand-dug trenches, she managed to channel water from the pump, turning the dry patch of earth into a thriving plot of green. She found Martha's old recipe book and began to cook in earnest, filling the cabin with the forgotten smells of baking bread and simmering stews. She was making a home of this place, not just a shelter. She was putting down roots, even as she feared they would be torn up at any moment. Silas, for his part, began to change. The walls of his solitude, so carefully constructed over 5 years of grief, began to crumble. He found himself talking more, not just to Tom, but to Alara. He told her about his parents, who had homesteaded this very land. He spoke of the blizzard of '78 that had nearly wiped them out. And one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance, he spoke of Martha. She loved this time of day, he said, his voice soft. She said it was when the land stopped fighting you and just let you be. He pointed to a small, gnarled apple tree at the edge of the garden. She planted that. Said every home needed an apple tree for pies. It's never given us a single apple. He chuckled, a low, rusty sound. Stubborn thing. Alara listened, her heart aching for the woman she would never know and for the man who had lost her. She was sitting in Martha's chair, cooking in her kitchen, tending her garden. She felt like an intruder, a ghost haunting another ghost's life. You must miss her terribly, she said quietly. Silas was silent for a long time, his gaze lost in the deepening twilight. It's not the missing that's the hardest, he finally said. It's the quiet. The house. It forgot how to be a home. It was just a place to sleep. Until you and the boy came. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. It was the closest he had ever come to saying he wanted them to stay. The air thickened, charged with unspoken feelings. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know how to respond, what to say to a confession of such profound loneliness. It was Tom who broke the spell. He came bursting out of the cabin, the wooden horse Silas had carved for him in his hand. Silas, Boulder stepped on my horse. He needs a doctor. The crisis was averted. The fragile moment passed. But it left an echo, a resonance that changed the dynamic between them yet again. They were no longer just a man offering shelter and a woman earning her keep. They were becoming something else, something more complex and far more terrifying. They were becoming a unit, a family. This new, fragile intimacy was tested a week later. A rider approached the ranch, not from the direction of town, but from the east, the direction from which Alara and Tom had fled. Alara was hanging laundry on the line, the clothespins in her mouth, when she saw the dust cloud. Her blood ran cold. Her first instinct was to grab Tom, to run, to hide. The old terror was a coiled snake in her gut, always ready to strike. Silas came out of the barn, a rifle held loosely in his hand. He didn't seem alarmed, just watchful. Stay on the porch with the boy, he said to her, his voice calm. The rider was a circuit sheriff, a weary-looking man with a drooping mustache and a tarnished star pinned to his vest. He reined in his horse a respectful distance from the house. Silas Croft, the sheriff called out. That's me, Silas replied, not moving from his spot. Name's Sheriff Miller. I'm based out of Castor County, 2 days east of here. Got a notice from a Judge Pettigrew about a woman, Alara Vance, and her son. Seems her husband's family filed a claim on the boy. The judge issued a warrant for her arrest. For kidnapping her own child. Alara felt the world drop out from under her. She staggered back against the porch post, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. Tom, sensing her fear, ran to her and wrapped his arms around her legs. The notice says she was headed west, the sheriff continued, his eyes scanning the property. Seen anyone like that pass through here? Silas stood unmoving for a beat, his face an unreadable mask. Alara held her breath. This was it. This was the moment he would hand them over. He was a law-abiding man. He had given them charity, but he wouldn't break the law for them. He would point to the porch and say, "There she is." Silas shifted his weight. "Can't say that I have," he said, his voice as steady and even as the flat horizon. "Just me out here. Been that way for years." The sheriff's gaze flickered toward the house, toward the laundry line where a woman's dress and a boy's small shirt flapped in the breeze. His eyes met Silas's. A long, silent moment passed between the two men. The sheriff was no fool. He saw the evidence, but he also saw the rifle in Silas's hand and the unyielding look in his eyes. The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound of a man who was paid too little to die for someone else's family squabble. "All right then," he said, tipping his hat. "Sorry to bother you." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a ringing silence in his wake. Alara felt her knees go weak with relief. She sank onto the porch steps, pulling Tom into her lap and burying her face in his hair. She was shaking uncontrollably. Silas walked over and stood before her. He laid the rifle against the porch railing and crouched down, bringing himself to her level. "Alara," he said, his voice gentle, "you need to tell me everything." And so she did. Sitting there on the porch of the home that had become her sanctuary, she told him the whole ugly story. She told him about Jonah's fists and his family's greed. She told him about Judge Pettigrew, Jonah's uncle, and the mockery of a hearing where they tried to paint her as a hysterical, incompetent woman. She told him about her flight in the dead of night, with Tom bundled in her arms. She laid her past bare, all the fear and shame and desperation. When she was finished, her voice was raw, her cheeks wet with tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. She waited for his judgment, for the disgust or the pity. Silas simply reached out and placed his large, rough hand over hers where it rested on Tom's head. His touch was warm and steady. "They won't take him," he said. "It wasn't a promise. It was a vow. This is your home now. I won't let them." But they both knew it wasn't that simple. The law was on their side. The world was on their side. A piece of paper from a corrupt judge 1,000 miles away had more power than Silas's rifle or his word. Sheriff Miller might have been persuaded to look the other way, but another lawman might not be so accommodating. And the whispers from town, fanned by the likes of Mrs. Gable, could easily turn into a formal complaint, bringing the law down on them whether they wanted it or not. Their peace was shattered. The threat was no longer a vague possibility. It had a name and a face. They were living on borrowed time, and the clock was ticking faster now. That night, the conversation they had been avoiding finally took place. They sat at the kitchen table long after Tom had gone to sleep. The lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the small cabin feel like the last safe place on earth. "Lying to the law is a dangerous game," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. "You could lose everything because of me." "I've already lost everything that mattered once," Silas countered, his voice low and intense. "I'm not keen on doing it again." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. "That sheriff, he wasn't the real problem. He was just a symptom. The real problem is what Mrs. Gable said in the store. It isn't proper." Alara flinched, the memory still raw. "I know. A lone woman and child living with a single man." Silas continued, laying out the cold, hard facts. "To folks like her, that's a sin. And if they think you're a sinner, they'll believe any other story told about you. They'll believe you're an unfit mother. They'll help Jonah's family take Tom, and they'll call it Christian justice." A cold dread settled in Alara's stomach. He was right. Their arrangement, born of desperation and compassion, was indefensible in the eyes of the world. It was a weapon that could be used against them. "So I run again," she said, the words tasting like poison. "Take Tom and disappear before they can." "No," Silas said, his voice firm. "You're done running." He took a deep breath, his hands flat on the table, as if bracing himself. "There's another way. A way to make it proper. A way to give you a name they can't question and a protection the law will have to recognize." Alara stared at him, her heart starting to pound. She knew what he was going to say before the words left his lips. "Marry me, Alara." The words fell into the silence of the room. They weren't spoken with passion or romance, but with the grim finality of a strategic decision in a war they were losing. "It would be a contract," he went on, his voice steady, explaining it as if it were a business arrangement. "My name, for your safety. A roof over your head, for the work you do here. Nothing would have to change between us. It would just be a piece of paper, a shield. It would make Tom my legal son. No judge, no greedy in-laws could touch him then. They'd have to come through me. Alara's mind reeled. Marriage. The institution that had been her prison, her source of pain and fear. Could it now be her salvation? She looked at Silas, at his earnest, weathered face, the deep sincerity in his eyes. He was offering her everything. Safety, a home, a future for her son. He was offering to stand between her and the world. But could she do it? Could she tie herself to another man, even a good man? Could she bear to be a wife again, even in name only? The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her chest. But then she thought of Tom, sleeping peacefully in the next room. She thought of his future, of the terror of being hunted, of the exhaustion of running. Silas was offering her son a father, a protector, a name. You don't have to answer now, Silas said, seeing the turmoil in her face. Think on it. But Alara knew she didn't need to think. The choice was not between this marriage and freedom. It was between this marriage and losing her son. There was no choice at all. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his across the table. There is one thing that would have to change, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Silas frowned, confused. What's that? I would no longer be Mrs. Alara, she said. I would be Mrs. Croft. A slow understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a look of profound, solemn respect. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. The contract was sealed. The wedding was as stark and simple as the landscape around them. They rode the wagon into Prairie Dog Creek on a Tuesday morning, the day the circuit judge was in town. They bypassed the church and Mrs. Gable entirely, heading straight for the makeshift courthouse in the back of the land office. The judge was a harried man with ink stains on his fingers, more interested in property disputes than matters of the heart. He read the short ceremony from a worn book, his voice a monotone drone. Tom stood between them, holding both their hands. He didn't fully understand what was happening, only that it was important, a solemn occasion that made his mother's face look pale and determined and made Silas stand even taller than usual. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss. Silas simply squeezed Alara's hand, a brief, reassuring pressure, before he signed the certificate with a steady hand. Alara signed after him, her new name, Alara Croft, looking foreign and strange on the page. Their public debut as a married couple happened immediately after. They walked from the land office to the general store, the newly signed marriage certificate tucked safely in Silas's pocket. The news had already spread through the small town with the speed of a prairie fire. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, a hush fell over the usual morning crowd. Mrs. Gable was there, conferring with two other women from the church auxiliary. She turned as they approached, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. This was the moment, the confrontation they had both been dreading and preparing for. Silas, Mrs. Gable said, her voice sharp, foregoing any pleasantries. I hear you've done a rash thing. Silas stopped in front of her. He didn't release Alara's hand. Tom stood on his other side, clutching his father's trousers. They looked like a family. I've married a good woman, Mildred, Silas said, his voice calm and carrying in the sudden quiet. There's nothing rash about it. This woman, Mrs. Gable sneered, her eyes flicking dismissively over Alara. A stranger? A vagrant with a child? Have you forgotten your dear Martha so quickly? Have you no respect for her memory? The mention of Martha was a deliberate cruelty, a knife twisted in a wound. Alara felt Silas flinch, his grip tightening on her hand. But before he could speak, Alara found her own voice. It came from a deep, protected place inside her, a well of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Respecting Martha's memory, Alara said, her voice clear and steady, is why he showed kindness to a mother and child in need. It's what any good Christian would do. It's what my husband does. He is a good man. She looked directly into Mrs. Gable's sour face. We are a family now. The law says so, and God knows the truth of it, whether you choose to or not. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. No one spoke to Mildred Gable that way, but Alara wasn't finished. She looked around at the watching faces, the curious and the judgmental. My son has a father now, she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. A man who will protect him and provide for him. This is our home, and we would thank you all to respect our privacy. With that, She tugged gently on Silas's hand. "Come, husband. We have supplies to purchase." She swept past a stunned and speechless Mrs. Gable and into the store, her head held high. Silas followed, a look of stunned admiration on his face. He had been prepared to defend her, to fight for her. He had not expected her to raise her own shield, to fight for them both with such quiet, unassailable dignity. The atmosphere in the store was entirely different from their last visit. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, hurried forward, a nervous smile on his face. "Mrs. Croft," he said, the name sounding new and important. "Mr. Croft, what can I get for you this fine morning?" The whispers were still there, but they were different now. They were whispers of shock, of grudging respect, of a story that had just become a local legend. The vagrant woman had become the rancher's wife, and she was not a woman to be trifled with. As they loaded their supplies into the wagon, one of the men who had been lounging on the boardwalk, a farmer named Peterson, tipped his hat. "Congratulations on the wedding, Croft," he said, a genuine smile on his face. "She seems like a fine woman." It was a small gesture, but it was an earthquake. It was acceptance. The ride home was filled with a new kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness or unspoken tension. It was the silence of aftermath, of a battle won. The marriage certificate in Silas's pocket felt heavier now, more real. It wasn't just a shield. It was a foundation. When they reached the ranch, Silas helped her down from the wagon. Their hands lingered for a moment. He looked at her, his gray eyes full of an emotion she couldn't quite name. It was more than gratitude, more than respect. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "For what you said back there. For everything. We are a family," she replied softly. "We protect our own." That night, nothing and everything had changed. They still ate at the same table. Tom still slept on the pallet by the fire. But when it was time for bed, a new, profound awkwardness settled over the small cabin. She was his wife. This was her home. His bed. Alara stood by the hearth, her back to him, her heart thumping. Silas stood by the door to the porch, his hat in his hands, turning it over and over. I'll head out to the barn," he said finally, his voice strained. "Silas," she said, turning to face him. "You can't sleep in the barn. You're the master of this house. It isn't right. And it isn't right to make you." This wasn't the arrangement. "The arrangement has changed," she said softly. "We stood before the whole town today. We can't live a lie here. In our own home." She took a breath, her courage faltering. It is big enough." The air crackled with the implication. He was her husband. She was his wife. He looked at her, standing in the warm firelight, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. He saw not the desperate woman he had found on the trail, but a woman of incredible strength and grace. A partner. He walked slowly toward the bed, the one he had shared with Martha, the one that had been cold and empty for 5 long years. He sat on the edge, his back to her. He took off his boots, the thud of each one on the floorboards marking a point of no return. Alara moved to the other side of the bed and slipped under the covers, her body rigid. Silas blew out the lantern, plunging the room into darkness, save for the faint orange glow of the embers in the hearth. He lay down on top of the quilt, a chasm of unspoken promises and fears separating their bodies. They lay there for what felt like an eternity, two strangers bound by a vow, listening to the sound of each other's breathing. This marriage, born of necessity and forged in defiance, had brought them to this new, uncharted territory. It was a marriage of protection, a contract. But as Alara lay there in the quiet darkness, feeling the warmth of his presence beside her, she realized with a terrifying jolt that for the first time in her life, in a husband's bed, she felt completely and utterly safe. And she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and frightened her, that their contract was destined to be broken, replaced by something far more real and infinitely more precious. The quiet ranch had given them shelter, the law had given them a name, but it was their shared stand against the world that had finally, truly, made them a family.